Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Cato Institute. My name is Andrey Илларионов. I'm senior fellow here at the Center for Global Liberty and Prosperity. When several months ago we have started preparation to this event, we were hoping to have almost purely academic discussion on the situation in Ukraine 4 years since the beginning of the Revolution of Dignity in November 2013. But the development of the last several weeks, and especially the yesterday's and today's night events, have corrected slightly our plans. As we all know, yesterday's night unprecedented storm by hundreds of commanders of the security service of Ukraine of the private apartment of one of our speakers today, the former president of the Republic of Georgia and the former governor of Odessa region, the leader of movement of new forces, Mihhail Sаакашвили, and attempt of the Ukrainian authorities to arrest him, and it has been publicly admitted yesterday by the Office of the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, without any indictment, any summons, any document from law enforcement bodies, has shocked Ukrainian society and the world alike, and sparked seems to be like a genuine political crisis in Ukraine. Even more unprecedented became immediate mass mobilization of tens of thousands of Ukrainian citizens who, after more than 4 hours battle with police forces, have freed Mikhail Saakashvili. Therefore, so our intention largely remains the same, is to try to understand what has really happened in Ukraine in the last 4 years, why it has happened, what achievements have been made and what mistakes have been made within Ukraine and by Ukrainian allies in the West. What can and should West do now? First of all, we probably need to devote some time to understand the nature of the current crisis. We have probably no better person to learn about it than Mikhail Saakashvili himself, former president of Georgia, former governor of Odessa region, leader of movement of new forces. We are looking for a Skype connection with Kyiv right now. He is at Maidan, just has delivered a speech, and I am asking our technical team to see whether we have a connection with Kyiv right now. Okay. Do we have?
I'm not Mr. Saakashvili.
Okay. Yes, we see. Okay, so could you tell us, it's Mr. Fedorin, the head of the Bindukidze Center in Kyiv for economic research. Mr. Fedorin, could you tell us when Mr. Saakashvili could join us?
He's still delivering his speech. The square is full of people, and I think 2 to 3 minutes will be enough to do it. So I propose to begin with the second speaker, and we'll be here.
Okay. Thank you. In this case, probably we'll start this almost academic program that I talked about, and I will ask just to put a short snapshot presentation about the current state of Ukraine over the last few years. This is just very basic information. Probably many of you know these facts, but just to update you with the current events. So over the last several years, since year 2013, Ukrainian government was able to address the most important issue for establishing long-term sustainable economic growth, reduction in size of government. As you can see, it has achieved some progress by year 2016, but in year 2017, size of government started to grow. And according to the last plans of the Ukrainian government and the IMF, this indicator should grow to year 2020, and by that year it would probably reach almost the same level as Ukraine had before the revolution. which makes very unstable, if ever possible, sustainable economic growth. On the other side, the Ukrainian government was incredibly successful, if it's possible to say, in increasing government debt. As you can see, in year 2017, it was slightly more than 11% of GDP. As of November year 2017, it reached 86% of GDP, which for the country of such level of economic development makes it almost impossible to continue any sustainable economic growth. What is especially striking that very often observers are talking about the very serious impact of the war that is waged by Russia against Ukraine in east of the country and the heavy burden of military expenditure of Ukraine. The real data do not support this claim. As you can see, the overall defense expenditure of Ukraine was slightly more than 2% of GDP in the last 2 years and falling. At the same time, the debt service is more than 2 times higher than the current defense expenditure. So it is rather hard to explain the current economic situation and current economic problems, financial problems, rising debt of Ukraine by defense expenditures. One of the issues that has attracted a lot of attention in Ukraine and among observers of Ukrainian events is the situation in the banking sector. As you can see here, in year 2011, Ukraine occupied the 3rd position from the bottom in the indicator of number of commercial banks for 100,000 of population. Only Indonesia and Turkey had low numbers. It was extremely low level of financial debts. Number of commercial bank branches per 100 adults put Ukraine in the bottom position in the world. Nevertheless, National Bank of Ukraine started the process of further reduction of number of commercial banks. As you can see, it reduced number of banks by half. As a result of that, financial debts for Ukrainian economy has been reduced even further, and financial resources available for business became very scarce. Foreign exchange reserves fell substantially, and especially from summer year 2014 to February year 2015, the speed of squandering foreign exchange reserves in Ukraine with the new government was approximately 3 times faster than under President Yanukovych, in calculation per month or per year, as you can see. As a result of that, Ukrainian hryvnia has been devalued and lost about 70% of its value before these crises. Especially worrisome is a decline in economic freedom index, according to the Fraser Institute. As you can see, is going down, and initial indicators for year 2016 also showing further decline in economic freedom index. As a result of this, GDP growth was very limited in the last 2 years, after more than 16% decline in year 2014 and year 2015. Even more worrisome is a decline in rule of law measured by Freedom House, as you can see here, over the last several years. A reflection of this situation is the substantial changes in public opinion polls. Here, as you can see, the result of the 3rd annual Ukrainian municipal survey performed on behalf of the Canadian government. As you can see, for January and February year 2017, according to different regions of Ukraine. Even in the region of Vinnytsia, the birth or the kind of the central place for the President Poroshenko, the support of the president is relatively low. Strongly approve his actions about 3% of population, 28% just approve. Majority of people do not have such view. A very similar picture about the support of the current government through the different regions. So I would stop here just to give some kind of general picture about the Ukraine situation. And once again, we'll see whether we have a connection with Kyiv right now. So. All right, looks like we're still waiting for Mr. Saakashvili to join us. So in this case, I would invite to the podium our two speakers, two distinguished speakers, Катерина Смаглий and Сергей Носенко. All right, Mr. Fedorin, so just could you tell us?
I think it's a matter of a minute or two.
All right, okay, thank you. Okay. Mrs. Smagli, Mr. Nosенко, could you please join me here at the panel? Let me introduce, first of all, Катерина Смаглий. She is the director of the Cato Institute's office in Kyiv. Prior to joining the Cato Institute, she served as a consultant of the European Endowment for Democracy, program director at the International Renaissance Foundation in Ukraine, and political assistant at the US Embassy in Kyiv. Last August, Katerina has written an article, Wake Up Call for Ukrainian Civil Society, that sparked explosion of debate on what is going on with the NGO sector in Ukraine, what is right and what is wrong, and what policy should be taken by the Western allies towards Ukrainian civil society. Mrs. Smagli, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much, Dr. Илларионов and the Cato Institute for hosting today's Ukraine event. It is a real honor to be here and to discuss the intriguing and intellectually puzzling process of Ukraine's democratic transformations, which is always vibrant and certainly never boring. At the beginning, let me say that I see the Euromaidan revolution as the most promising event of the European continent over the last decade. At the background of growing authoritarianism, populism, nationalism, and Euroscepticism, Ukraine has demonstrated something different because its people stood up for the universal values of freedom, democracy, the rule of law, and they clearly, by standing up for these common values, Ukraine has once again demonstrated that it became and remains to be a strategic partner of the United States, that contributed to the European and global security, and potentially a strong and reliable partner of the European Union and the United States. And thus, to answer the key question of our today's debate, I would say that yes, Ukraine is on the right course because its geopolitical choice has been safeguarded, and that no matter what, Ukrainians will be able to stand up to their rights again, as they did so many times in the past. However, the wake-up call is indeed needed, and not just for Ukraine's political elites, for the failure to deliver on the anti-corruption reform, but also for Ukraine's civil society leaders and the international community. Because too much is at stake at the moment. 4 years after the Revolution of Dignity, the new Ukraine remains out of reach. Experts warn that a counter-revolution is on the rise and that Ukraine may now slide back to authoritarianism and lose the democratic gains that had been attained at such a high price. The president and the government had a historical chance to write a new chapter of Ukraine's history, the chapter void of corruption scandals and politically motivated charges against their opponents. The people of Ukraine had very high expectations of their leaders, as they, the leaders, were propelled to government literally on the backbones of Ukraine's civil society protesters. More than 100 people were killed, and speaking at the Verkhovna Rada exactly 2 years ago in December 2015, Vice President Biden put it very bluntly, looking in the eyes of Ukraine's parliamentary members, their sacrifice is your obligation. To make some fair statements about Ukraine's reform, we have to acknowledge that indeed some reforms had a very good start at the beginning, despite the illegal annexation of Crimea, the war in the East, and Ukraine's plummeting economy. Ukraine did achieve several breakthroughs. It improved its security and defense, established a much more capable army, cleaned up the endemically corrupt oil and gas sector and now has zero dependency on Russian gas. It set up 3 anti-corruption agencies, including the Anti-Corruption Bureau, Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office, and the National Agency for Corruption Prevention. It established the famous, I believe now the world-famous procurement system, Prozora, or transparent, which allows Ukraine's government to save millions of hryvnia on funds which were previously embezzled by corrupt officials who were selling different goods for the state. The new police has been set up and pension, education, and health reform bills were adopted. But this is barely enough. As Ukraine's journalist Vitaly Sich recently wrote, I thought that after the killing of 100 people on the Maidan, after the deaths of thousands of people in the East, Ukraine will never be the same. However, we still see that corruption, schemes, and political deals still exist at the highest level. For the last 3 years, President Poroshenko has been working very hard on establishing his power vertical to preserve his grip on power. Although Ukraine is de jure a parliamentary presidential republic, de facto we have the presidential system in place. Poroshenko controls the security services, the army, diplomacy, the prosecutor's office, with at least 22 reformers forced out of the cabinet of ministers in 2016, the president now controls the majority of the cabinet of ministers members. He also exercises considerable control over the Central Election Commission and the judiciary. Ukraine's unreformed SBU, or security services, appears to be out of control and used by the authorities to advance their political and business goals. Since Russia launched its aggression in the East, SBU has accumulated massive powers and became even more secretive and unaccountable. It opens politically motivated cases even against former Euromaidan activists like Yulia Marushevskaya, the famous member of Saakashvili's team in Odessa, who was in charge of the Odessa Customs Office. Police reform is also incomplete, and police became a political weapon as well. Arrests and illegal deportations of Mikhail Saakashvili's associates without court warrants illustrate this most evidently. At the time when Ukraine's post-Euromaidan leaders do not hesitate to arrest political opponents, they fail to convict even one person for the murder of 100 protesters at Euromaidan. The judicial reform is similarly slow. It has taken 18 months to nominate judges for the new Supreme Court. Almost 30 out of 113 new Supreme Court judges were disqualified by civil society for violating judicial ethics, possessing ill-gotten wealth, and making unlawful rulings. But nevertheless, President Poroshenko accepted their credentials. In the last months, it became increasingly evident that Ukraine's anti-corruption bodies cannot fulfill their function, and that presidential administration attempts to control their work. Just today, Yegor Sobolev, the famous Euromaidan activist, was stripped of his powers as chairman of the Rada Committee for Anti-Corruption, and 2 members of the pro-presidential coalition have tabled a resolution which would allow them to dismiss NABU chairman without an audit, and probably place somebody very loyal to the president to control this institution. So we witness attempts to diminish NABU's powers and subordinate it to the Office of the Prosecutor General and thus to the president. The effectiveness of new anti-corruption bodies is also limited in the absence of independent court system. Poroshenko has not yet submitted the law on the anti-corruption court, although he has received recommendation from the Venice Commission, and publicly ridiculed the very concept and idea of the anti-corruption court on multiple occasions. In short, the authorities appear to be imitating the fight against corruption, and instead they go after anti-corruption agencies and anti-corruption activists. As long as this continues, the corrupt officials can rest safe. At this background, it doesn't come up as a surprise that de-oligarchization has not taken place. Instead of demonopolizing certain sectors of Ukraine's economy, the government builds friendships with some oligarchs, selectively goes after the other, and allows its loyalists to create new monopolies. The attacks on civil societies have increased. According to the Ukrainian Union of Journalists, at least in the last 11 months, there had been 85 instances of physical assaults on journalists. No progress has been made on high-profile cases like the killing of journalist Pavel Sheremet. The authorities are drawing clear red lines for civil society organizations that work in the area of anti-corruption. And the state-controlled media discredit civil society leaders and the very idea of peaceful protests. As a result, Ukraine's leaders lose support both domestically and internationally. Just yesterday, the State Department has, for the first time, I believe, issued its very strong statement urging the government to step up its efforts in the fight against corruption by providing support, resources, and defense to the new anti-corruption bodies. As Secretary Tillerson put it, it serves no purpose for Ukraine to find for its body in Donbass if it loses its soul to corruption. The European Commission has issued a similarly strong statement almost simultaneously, and at the last Eastern Partnership Summit, which was held in Brussels on November 24th, the European Commission decided to hold back on transferring to Ukraine the third and final tranche of 600 million euro of aid. Among the stumbling blocks were the failure to launch an automatic check on electronic assets declarations. To sum up, this is a critical moment of Ukraine. For Ukraine, the President Poroshenko is busy reconstructing his power vertical before the 2019 elections, and the combination of weakening economy and war without end is paving road for populists and hardline nationalists. The authorities already use the controlled media to rally the nation's citizens around patriotism as a way of deflecting the attention from the difficulties they are facing at home. The EU and the United States are busy with their own priorities, and thus the return of Ukraine fatigue and decline in assistance is a real possibility. So we believe that it is necessary now to discuss new approaches to help the people of Ukraine and its leaders to persevere on the path of structural reforms and to ensure that Ukraine stays on the right track. One of the ways to do this is for the West to open an honest dialogue with Ukraine and stop pretending that things are okay because things are not okay. The system would have gotten nowhere defending Ukraine's corrupt political system without Western support. We've seen a lot of friendly pressure in the past, but unfortunately it doesn't help. So just the opposite, the old forces of the old Ukraine have waited patiently for the Maidan fever to evaporate, to go on the offensive. So as long as Western leaders see Ukraine as a protector of Europe against Russia, Poroshenko can act domestically as any other Ukrainian politician for whom the borders between power, money, and force are blurred. We will discuss other policy recommendations after every speaker will have a chance to present his or her statements, and I would welcome your comments and questions as well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mrs. Smagli. So can we check whether we have, okay, looks like we have a connection with Kyiv. Right. All right. So it looks like we're establishing connection. So nearly 4 years have passed since the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity brought down the corrupt government of Viktor Yanukovych. This revolution inspired widespread support in Ukraine and around the world and generated hope for a better future for the country and for the whole region. Yet Ukrainian expectations are far from being met. The economy has shrunk by 16%, the authorities have devalued the currency and defaulted on national debt. Living standards of Ukrainians have plummeted. Economic growth remains weak. What is the most important, that levels of corruption and political and civil liberties have hardly changed. Good evening, Mr. President. You just came from the meeting near Verkhovna Rada, Parliament of Ukraine. Yesterday's event have shocked many observers, sincere and friendly supporters of new Ukraine, Ukraine that is fighting aggressor, Putin's Kremlin, Ukraine that is looking forward for a bright future among free, democratic and peaceful nations. It was a shock for those who for the last 4 years have never expected anything similar to what with indignation we saw yesterday's night and today's night near the Ukrainian parliament. Mr. President, please tell us what all these attacks and all these actions of the authorities towards you, towards many other political leaders and civil activists means. How should we understand the very nature of the current political regime? whether Mr. Poroshenko became another edition of Mr. Yanukovych, what mistakes have been made by the West in its policy towards Ukraine over the course of the last 4 years, what the West should do now. Mr. President, welcome.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. Oh, sorry, I have lost a little bit voice now. I just came from gathering, that's why I was late, where we have several thousand people standing in front of the Ukrainian Rada. It's like daily events now. They come, they go. Last Sunday we had biggest ever march after second Maidan, after the Euromaidan, march against corruption. The entire Krishchatik was full of people. Well, look, the things against us, they got built up for some time already. First, they allowed the local mafia to expel me from Odessa. Then Poroshenko arranged it through Ministry of Justice, my party's registration to be cancelled. Then I was deprived of citizenship for all kind of fake reasons. And then I was thrown out from the country actually as a result. Then they tried to prevent me from coming back through absolutely illegal means, through blocking the trains and on the Polish territory, through announcing that all the border pass points are mined. And now they, on false pretenses, they tried to arrest me yesterday. In fact, they tried to arrest me without arrest warrant, without my lawyer being present, without submitting any formal document, which is a rude violation of Ukrainian law. So that's all I can say. What is happening about me? But I think overall that's an all-out attack on Ukraine's institutions. National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine is under huge attack. We have huge problems with independent members of parliament that are being harassed. Today, indeed, they took decision, the committee, to fire the independent chairman of the anti-corruption committee of the parliament, Yegor Sobolev. You obviously have anti-corruption activists under attack. You have all kind of things happening. There are all kind of ugly things. Well, that doesn't help Ukraine. That doesn't help Ukraine's image in the world. I think that weakens Ukraine. That makes Ukraine's adversary, Russia, stronger. That's all I can say as a starting point. What are your questions?
All right. Thank you, Mr. President. Just speaking to us, even with the problems with your voice. I cannot avoid the question that became in the center of debate yesterday and today. Prosecutor General of Ukraine yesterday has accused you in conspiring with Putin's Russia, calling you as an agent of FSB. And today, about 5 hours ago, President Poroshenko himself has called you and your supporters and your colleagues as enemy of Ukrainian people, working on behalf of Russia. You were president of Georgia for 9 years, and under your leadership, you and your team have implemented the probably most radical economic, political, and legal reforms in that country, making it one of the most dynamic country in the region, one of the cleanest from the point of corruption, with the most effective police, honest and respected in the society, with economic growth about 12% per year. That country became very respected in the region, and not only in the region. You moved to Ukraine and became governor of the Odessa region, where you have studied program of fighting corruption, closing the border with the Russian enclave in Moldova, Transnistria, building highway to the member of the European Union, Romania, and so on. Now, several weeks ago, you have proposed a new plan for, if I'm not mistaken, for 70 days, what to do in Ukraine. So should we understand that it's all secret FSB plans for Georgia and Ukraine to make them very effective, dynamic, prosperous countries allies of the European and international civilized community. Could you tell us a little bit more about the secret FSB plan that they think that you are implementing in Ukraine?
Well, of course, joke of the situation is that this ridiculous baloney about me being FSB agent. The ridiculousness of the situation is that they are trying to use the term enemies of the people, enemies of Ukraine. And that's very sad because Poroshenko is trying to play on the terms that should not have been used in Ukraine, in modern Ukraine, in Ukraine that aspires to be European, because that's how we see it that's not how we saw it. I think the main difference that should happen between Ukraine and Russia is that the system of and two different systems of government, two different systems of thinking, two different systems of how you achieve your success. And from that standpoint, it doesn't help Ukraine. I think it's very important to understand that we are in a situation where the only way how Ukraine can win this competition is not through all-out military attack, because it simply cannot match Russian capabilities. And there are many other reasons why it shouldn't be doing now this. It's through obtaining double-digit growth, through building better roads than Russia, through giving better perspective than Russia gives its citizens. And if it ever happens, I was in NATO summit present in Bucharest in 2009 when Putin said Ukraine is not a real country, it's a territory. And that's a Putin's gamble. He wants to prove that Ukraine is a territory, not a real country. So from that standpoint, I think if Ukraine succeeds, then that's the end of Putin. That's the closest way to end Putin's system. And the very moment Putin has crisis, Putin is undermined inside Russia, I'll tell you, Ukraine will regain its territorial integrity. So that's how I see a plan of victory for Ukraine. And that's my secret plan, obviously, but a very open one, because I talk about it every day. Ukraine, right now, Ukraine has growth of less than 2%. If it grows with this same pace, it will only regain the level last year of Yanukovych in 2032. Which is, of course, 15 years from now. Now, that's not an option for Ukraine. Ukraine cannot afford to grow double digit. Ukraine should grow cannot afford to grow 2%. It needs to grow double digit. In order to grow double digit, it needs to end corruption. In order to end corruption, it needs to get rid of political class. And the way to do it legally is through National Anti-Corruption Bureau, which is right now blocked by Poroshenko personally. It is through bolstering the younger reformist groups, and it's through also votes in parliament, street pressure, because without street pressure, they are not going to act. That's for me, that's evident. So that's why we support all the new groups, but also we want to pressure them to adopt law on anti-corruption court, law on impeachment, law on the lifting of immunity of MPs, and new election law. Having said all that, right now Poroshenko's group is on all-out attack. They attack me, they attack Sobol, they attack Nambu, they attack and beat up anti-corruption activists in the regions, and it's frankly starts to look more and more like very unsavory neighboring practices, except from the fact that Ukraine is not Russia. I think Ukraine has amazing credentials of not being Russia. It's a freedom-loving people. It's a people that's very self-organized at their resolute moments. These are people who always make forcing themselves to reject any authoritarian trends. It's a people that has this free spirit of Cossacks, including and the Austro-Hungarian tradition of statehood, and Magdeburg law of self-governing cities. So it has all the credentials that Russia doesn't have. On the other hand, Ukraine's oligarchs live exactly like people in Russian oligarchs. They formally are at war, but Poroshenko is paying 1 billion rubles into 1 billion hryvnia into the budget of Russia only last year through his businesses in Russia. We have Medvedchuk here, who is close friend of Poroshenko and his business partner, who also have close friend of Putin. So, we are at war with Russia. Russia is enemy right now. Putin's Russia is enemy of Ukraine. But on the other hand, Ukraine's elite is so much like Russian elites. It's amazing. But if Ukraine has to go to the West, and is going to the West, it has to go for middle class, not for oligarchs. But so far, middle class has been voting with their own, movements, and they've been going to the West without Ukraine. They've been just emigrating to Poland and other countries, Canada, etc. And that's not helped. Ukraine's population was 53 million when I voted for its independence as a student in Kiev in 1991, and maximum level of population right now is 35. If it continues the same way, maximum number of Ukrainians in 15 years from now will be 25 million people. Well, that's very small number for this country, and most of them will be retired people. So we are dealing with demographic catastrophe, and the only way to reverse all of this and to stop further disintegration of Ukraine is to have fast growth, fast development, fast reforms, and that's going to solve also the issue with Russia.
Thank you, Mr. President. Do you have time for a couple of questions from the audience? Okay, thank you. Okay, we have those who would like to ask Mr. President a question. Please, first of all, raise your hand, identify yourself, and pose a question as a question. Okay? Yes, microphone, please, here.
Sure.
Let's ask first question.
Over your role, partly, and you have declared that once the party split, that you stopped a vicious plan to remove you from the leadership role in Georgia. Meanwhile, you are fighting for the opposition in Ukraine. How can you reconcile being leaders of the two parties in two countries?
Well, I'm not pretending at all to be the leader of party in Georgia. I'm an honorary chairman there, but I assure you, I don't even intervene into strategic decisions. This is still the main opposition party in Georgia. I can predict that any next elections, I can make bet that they will win it, and it will be their win. I'm not pretending to be their leader. Of course, I'm the loudest voice of opposition here in Ukraine, and that's fact of life. Well, in Ukraine as well, I don't think I'll ever become president. I said I'm ready to become prime minister if it's necessary. I'm willing to assume this responsibility. I'm obviously a Ukrainian politician, active Ukrainian politician right now. Even if Poroshenko does, they'll call me enemy of Ukraine nation and deprived me of my passport. But here you hear them maybe noises from the street. Here we have like 6,000 or 7,000 people standing outside my tent and rallying. So if not, I'm not an Ukrainian politician. What are these people doing here? What these thousands of people that took me out from police when yesterday, how they gathered so fast from center of Kiev. That really means that I'm an Ukrainian politician. And I have my vision for future visions of Ukraine. Of course, I link those two. I don't think without successful Ukraine, Georgia can be long-term successful. I have my own benefit in mind for Georgia when I fight for Ukraine.
All right, thank you. Other questions? Oh, yes, please, Mike, here.
I have a question about the allegation against you. Yesterday, the General Prosecutor Office laid out a very serious allegation. So I would like you to clarify or say it's true or not true what you were accused of. Thank you.
Well, they accused me of some connection with certain Kurchenko. I don't know who Kurchenko is. I've never met him. I mean, I've heard that he exists, but I've never met him. I don't know him. I've not spoken to him. And this is typically, look, when they deprived me of my nationality, they falsified my signature. 2 years ago, Ministry of Interior of Ukraine put my head on a video or somebody else's body and put video we standing with Russian oligarch somewhere in Odessa. And then like a few days later, they had to recognize that it was fake. So I'm quite used to it, and I don't think anybody in the world would ever take it seriously. Certainly in Ukraine, people don't take it seriously.
All right. Any other questions? Mr. President, may I ask you probably one of the most important questions for the West, for Western allies of Ukraine nowadays. After these 4 years after Revolution of Dignity, what your advice would be for the West, the whole, and for the United States, for international organizations? What have been made not in the right way? What should be corrected? And which way the West should work with Ukraine now and in future? What's your advice for the West?
Look, the West has almost has given up on Ukraine. What I hear from my Western friends is what the story Ukrainian oligarchs want to put inside Ukraine and to plant the story. The story is, no matter what happens, Ukraine is lost. Ukraine will always be run by oligarchs. Ukrainian nation is not capable of building a modern functioning state in the sense we understand it. And we should just play on difference of different oligarchs and keep strike a right balance between them. Well, this is a very wrong story, but I've heard it from very respectable friends in Washington, in Brussels, all around the place, in Poland, and not give up on Ukrainian people. Ukrainian people are not are fully normal people. They are very talented, very hardworking, good people. And also, we should remember that many millions of Ukrainians have moved to other countries in recent years, and they can compare. They already know how the modern economy functions. So I have to tell you that the main task right now is not to give up on Ukraine, not to buy into this story that Ukraine is to be run by oligarchs. The West can easily kill corruption of Ukrainian oligarchs. The West can block their bank accounts. Well, look, lots of people in present Ukraine leadership that are attacking NABU and blocking investigations. They have their bank accounts in America or in Europe. I don't have any bank accounts in America and Europe, but they have. So the fact is that because they have these accounts, they are vulnerable. They cannot run to Russia anymore, and they cannot fly to the West when they are no longer presidents or prime ministers in the other positions. So use it, push them. You can push them much more efficiently, but people say, well, what's the use of pushing them? The next ones will be the same. It's not true. New generation is coming. It has been formed by Second Maidan to a large extent. There are young members of parliament like I am Leshchenko, Sveta Zalishchuk, lots of people like deputy heads of administrations, local deputy ministers that have got taste of power. They wanted to do reforms. Reforms they have not really worked, but they want to come back for more. And these are the allies of the West, real mental allies, not the oligarchs. Oligarchs internally are allies of the Russians, that's for sure.
Mr. President, thank you very much for joining us in this very important and very timely session. We wish you all the best, you and all Ukrainian people, in building a peaceful, democratic country and bright future.
Well, right now, first of all, Andrei, thank you for everything you are doing. Also, I have to tell you, you have lots of fans in Ukraine. People keep quoting me your quotations all the time. Second, I have to say that I'm lucky I'm in your air, because right now I would be sitting in some SBU cellar somewhere in center of Kiev if people had not freed me. So actually you are risking by taking an irregular into your Cato conference because I'm legally a fugitive right now. And third one, I have to say that when you wish to ask peaceful continuation, peaceful is the key word. We want peace here. We want peaceful democratic transition. And that will be decisive for the future of Ukraine and all of us. Thank you.
Once again, thank you very much. Be safe, and all Ukrainians must be safe and prosperous and democratic in free country. Thank you very much. right, we shall continue with our program, and I would invite Sергey Nосенко, Ukrainian businessman, the founder of the Analytical Center and Civil Political Movement Rozvitok, which means development. Please have your floor.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello, everybody, and thank you, Andrei and Cato Institute, for giving me this opportunity to speak to you and address U.S. community about the Ukraine. We have been discussing extensively what to say those days, and as you see, we just get so many news, and that's why we changed a lot our program. So we prepared the presentation with the figures, which you will probably see, and also address that, and you will see how much was lost during those years, those recent years, from the economical standpoint in Ukraine, and how much we declined, and how much poverty we have now. But the question is, we kind of having lots of events, historical Maidans, and after those Maidans, we kind of came to the same point. I mean, same sort of issues like corruption, like poverty, like absence of economical growth. And the question is why? Why it's happening in this way? Why this like rich and potentially great country is so poor and so in disaster? And the answer to this question could be that the system has been changed since 1991 when we restored our independence. And that's the key point. Now if you look at the political map of Ukraine, you see the same kind of tendency. I mean, you have left parties everywhere. I mean, it doesn't matter if they say they are nationalists, they're patriots, or they are just social democrats. They are all left. They kind of use the same rhetoric, and they say to the people, we are going to take from the rich and distribute, which is completely wrong. I mean, because we have witnessed those kind of political platform in the Soviet Union, and it failed, and it cost millions of lives. So why should Ukraine continue in this way in the 21st century? Coming back to history, we all admit that Ukrainians have a strong will to freedom and personal liberty. Probably is the only one country on the Soviet space which demonstrated this will so strongly on the first and the second Maidan, not taking into consideration the suffer and the loss of the 20th centuries, where both of the world wars were held practically in the territory of Ukraine, when we lost around 5 million people during famine, and it just the price people were paying for freedom, for their national identity. And what we have now is just not acceptable. I mean, the question of this panel is if Ukraine is on the right way, and the answer is no, absolutely no. And the next question is who's responsible? I would say this is the government. I mean, because people bringing them to power was expecting very different. They were expecting the change, the reform, not the prosecution. I mean, before prosecute, you have to change the system so people understand that in the current situation, every single entrepreneur in Ukraine is a potential criminal. I don't know if you feel it, but I was doing business in my country since '91 and then never get rid of that feeling, because in the Soviet Union there was an OBHSS who was prosecuting every kind of economical activity. Now we have prosecutor's office, we have fiscal authorities who are completely corrupt, they take bribes, and they just depress the economy. There is no respect for private property. That's why there is no investment in the country, because people could not protect their rights for property in the courts. They could not repatriate their profit because of the national bank making those regulations and practically making it impossible to get money out of the country. So in this world, economical growth is something essential. And then when we founded our organization, which we intentionally called development, we were focusing on those issues and traveling around the country, speaking to the ordinary people. We understood that they are not educated at all about their opportunities as economical individuals. You know, they still think about big government. They think about the state-owned economy, which is probably outdated already for many years. So this is kind of philosophy which is behind of the Ukraine. I mean, you don't need to have a great and big state budget to make people comfortable in your country. You just need to give them freedom and opportunities. And we are dreaming about this sort of a country where every individual, doesn't matter Ukrainians, Georgians, Armenians, Russians, British, French, they will feel comfortable. They will be comfortable to do business. They will be comfortable to live, to brought up children, and to be proud to be Ukrainian citizens. That's the essential point. Let's take several examples, like from the economical standpoint. I mean, Andrei mentioned the currency exchange, and this is completely right, and this is completely linked to IMF program which we have in Ukraine, because IMF is doing their work on the accounting basis and not taking into consideration the necessity to stimulate economical growth. I mean, and it appeared that nobody in the country was able to protect the sovereignty of Ukraine and to protect Ukrainian banks. We lost just around 87 banks for the last 3 years, and means we lost national capital. And moreover, we lost like 700 billion hryvnias in those banks. 700 million hryvnias is, for the old exchange rate, is almost $100 million. I mean, we don't need any kind of external financing if we learn how to be hosts in our own house. I mean, that's the problem. I mean, and the NBU, is the National Bank of Ukraine, is supposed to be an independent organization, but is nowadays it completely depends on the president. I mean, that's obvious. You know, for the moment, the National Bank governor is on vacation and long-term vacation, and no other governor is appointed in the time when the country is so poor and so in need of investments and strong politics in the financial sector. This is one thing. Then the other topic we are now discussing is that about the lethal weapon to protect Ukraine. Yes, it's important. I mean, it's important when you are at war. But look, who's gonna be in charge of that weapons? I mean, Oboronprom, everybody knows, is a monster. Is a corrupt monster which is just not transparent. I mean, how we can rely and get those weapons in this current system? I mean, this is a stress to everybody, and the community will be after complaining that at the end of the day that weapons ended to be sold to somebody. I mean, why don't we kill or ISIS? I mean, that's a big thing. I mean, and the other example is natural gas and Naftogaz, and we have been promised many times. And I'm from my business standpoint, I'm an investment banker. So we were trying to help the government many times to finance the the subway construction in Kiev and also trying to help them to reform Naftogaz. But at the end of the day, this is not transparent how they even choose the advisors. I mean, the example of Naftogaz is just there. I mean, Rothschild and the Rothschild were acting through their Moscow office. I mean, they were speaking with Yanukovych about splitting the Naftogaz, and now the same people they are speaking with the current government how they will split Naftogaz, and this is not transparent at all. We don't know anything about who's gonna be in charge of transit of natural gas. And the other story is everybody says that we need an investment to increase our own production. At the end of the day, as I said, you couldn't just get any kind of investment from outside because the rule of law is not there, is completely prohibitive to any kind of investor to put money into the country. So we will still be dependent, doesn't matter what the government say, we will still be dependent on the importing of natural gas. I mean, and then we all know that the gas which is coming from the side of Europe is in fact has Russian origin, unfortunately. And at the same time, in the 70s, Ukraine used to be the only one of the few natural gas producing regions in the Soviet Union before they start developing the Siberia. So that's a huge deposit there. And strategically, Ukraine is very important for the world. I mean, it's just, as I said, the wars were always there because of the geopolitical location. We have the best agricultural lands in Europe. So that's a country which can offer many things to the international community, international business communities and investors. But at this moment, we just could not realize that potential, unfortunately. So I just said about the main thing which are not good in the country, but to my mind, the plan is just completely changes the system. The system to deregulate, to remove the procedures which are source of corruption, and then after that we will be able to prosecute people because for the moment you literally can prosecute everybody. I mean, in our organization we have several business people like IT guys, and they always complain, I mean, about the law enforcement authorities are just a part of a business process, which is completely unacceptable. It doesn't matter if it's the tender procedures or just normal economical activity. The other thing is the tax reform. We should change the tax system, which is absolutely outdated. We should come back to the conditions when their national capital will be growing again and not declining like it happened right now. So from the international standpoint, I would suggest that we should not say Ukraine is the government in Ukraine. We should think about people and separate people and the government for the moment, because unfortunately, to my opinion, and it's supported by the facts that people are leaving the country, you know, that's like 30 million, 32 million people instead of official 45 is just very sad. I mean, young people leaving to live in Poland, in Germany, everywhere, they just don't stay. So we are losing the country, and that's the point to just completely redo the system. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Sergey. So now we're moving to the Q&A session, but let me ask first question for both of our speakers. Now we have a very clear-cut two different responses to the question that have been posed as the title of this panel. Is Ukraine on the right course? We have the very clear answer yes, and we have a clear answer no. So that's give us a floor for interesting discussion ahead of us. May I ask you, over the last time, there was a lot of comparison of the current government and current political regime with the previous one, Mr. Poroshenko with Mr. Yanukovych. Putting aside the foreign policy, putting aside the defense, the war in East Ukraine and situation in Crimea, let's talk about the internal domestic situation, domestic policies of the current government in economic area, towards political opponent and political system, towards civil society. What's your assessment? How would you compare these two governments, Mr. Yanukovych and Mr. Poroshenko? Mr. Poroshenko, similar, not similar? What is common, what is different between two governments?
You want to start, Kat?
No, I don't.
Yeah,
excuse me. Hello. Yeah, economically speaking, I would say this is the same because you know the story about debts and poor economical performance started exactly after Yanukovych was elected. I mean, the hard law enforcement and the raiders, that problem started there, and then the Maidan was also about that. I mean, because the economical activity of the people changed dramatically. I mean, you know, Yushchenko was very liberal in this way, and then people get hope. And now, and then Yanukovych changed it backwards. And Maidan, the second Maidan, the dignity revolution, was also because of that. But the new hope never came true because they just, the new government, they just headed the corruption system which was created by Yanukovych, unfortunately. All the verticals, they call it verticals, I mean, those the system of bribery from the regional level, bureaucrats to the top, they just didn't change anything and still working. I mean, ask the people who are dealing with the tax authorities, they're still there. I mean, you have to pay. You have to pay bribes to be allowed to work, which is nonsense.
All right, thank you.
Well, in my opinion, I think that it is simply improper to compare the presidents. And
can you speak up? Yes.
Can you hear me? Is
Yes,
it working? So, in my opinion, it is improper to compare the two presidents, and I believe that instead of comparing the personalities, we should simply say that change is never easy, and that the system has to be changed itself. You know, let me give you an example. Vice President Biden made multiple visits to Ukraine and pressed President Poroshenko to replace Prosecutor General Shokin, who we all believed was extremely corrupt and who did nothing to clean up the Prosecutor's General office and to clean up the business operations in Ukraine. Now we have the new and many people believed progressive Prosecutor General, Yuri Lutsenko, who was himself imprisoned by the previous regime. You know, he was a political prisoner in Yanukovych's era. Nevertheless, his office now repeats the same practices which existed years before. And I believe that the reform process in Ukraine has hit a considerable roadblock, and this is the prosecutor's office. Ukraine and all post-Soviet countries, they have inherited from the Soviet Union and even from the Russian Empire this tradition of a very strong prosecutor's general office, which is simply used, it was used by Peter the Great, by the sovereign, you know, as eyes and ears of the Tsar. In the Soviet regime, it was again the system that prosecuted people for politically motivated charges. And it is now again used by all presidents who identify themselves with the state. You know, by the way, in all post-Soviet constitutions, you have this notion of держава, you know, of the state. It's very difficult to explain what the state is all about, but the leaders, as soon as they become state leaders, they think that the state is them. So the constitutional reform is necessary to diminish the powers of the Prosecutor's General Office and to strip the president, whoever he will be, Yanukovych, Poroshenko, Yushchenko, Kuchma, of the possibility to use this as a mechanism for politically motivated persecution of his opponents. The Prosecutor's General Office should be narrowed down and become a very impartial and independent institution under the Ministry of Justice. But please avoid comparisons of personalities. I believe that President Poroshenko has faces challenges, international challenges and domestic challenges, which are simply unprecedented. And these challenges has never been faced by his predecessor, which enjoyed, I believe, a pretty comfortable life with President on the eastern border. You know, President Putin was his probably best friend and was more or less tolerated by the European and American friends. President Poroshenko does have to deliver on many other promises, but I believe that the current situation in Ukraine has probably still gives him a chance to demonstrate that he is a strong leader of the country, and with some corrections in the current policy, the Ukraine will divert into the right direction.
All right, thank you. Certainly, every opinion is some kind of respected. Nevertheless, it's rather hard to avoid comparison between not only institutions but between people. When I was in Ukraine, 9 of 10 Ukrainians told me different levels of comparison between exactly Mr. Poroshenko and Yanukovych in a very personal way that I would not repeat here. So that is why. Okay, we're moving to the Q&A session here from the audience. Once again, I would remind you, please identify yourself, and after that, pose your question. Okay, the gentleman over there, please.
Oleg Merkulov, I'm from media group Vesti from Riga, Latvia. So there is a big difference.
Please tell whom you address your question.
To both, and actually I'd like also, if I know you're a moderator, but maybe you can also
I think
tell your thoughts on the
our
issue.
speakers, they came from Ukraine and they know the situation better than anybody else.
Okay, so, well, we'll see whoever will want to take this question. So there is one big difference between Latvia and Ukraine. So Latvia is a member of European Union, Ukraine so far is not, right? But there is also one big similarity between Latvia and Ukraine. And governments of both countries right now have plans to close down Russian language schools. In Latvia, the program is being implemented by the Ministry of Education as we speak. And it was the reason...
Your question, please.
Yes, the question is, how wise do you think is to try to implement such a program in Ukraine in the current situation? Because in Latvia, it already draws protests.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I have heard nothing about Ukraine's government plans to close Russian language schools, and I have just simply to verify this information to be able to give you a kind of correct answer, proper answer to your question.
All right, thanks. Here, microphone.
Hello, my name is Yana Roginska. I'm Ukrainian, but I'm living in Washington, D.C. now. I'm a Cato intern currently. I want to thank you for the such summary of, like, perfectly you did the problems what Ukrainians facing now. But in terms of the solutions, what I've heard from the
You're posing your question.
both speakers. So the solutions that you proposed, from deregulation reforms to the constitutional reform, but this seems to be like a long-term perspective. What solution would you propose now, short-term solutions? Should there be impeachment or no impeachment to the president? Should we have the elections or no elections? Like, what short-term, what should we do, like, in short-term perspective right now?
I want to start there with that. We have to separate the war and the government, because they some sort of a lot of manipulation about that, and that's the base for answering. I mean, and my answer is that it's just very weird that the coalition itself has the support of less than 10% of the voters. I mean, so in any other country it would lead to an election. I mean, so that's political representation is an important mechanism of the democratic society. So we need to think about that. I mean, that we just could not continue in this way, because the country just maybe not surviving until the next cycle.
Okay.
Well, for me, the short-term solution is for the civil society activists and those promising Euromaidan political parties, which had been established shortly before the Euromaidan revolution and immediately afterwards, is to roll up their sleeves and to do their work in establishing strong and real political parties in Ukraine. Probably you've heard that on the eve of the next presidential elections, which are scheduled for, March 2019, we already kind of try to prematurely fill the niche of the new leader and weekend by presenting Slavko Vakarchuk, the famous Ukrainian rock singer, as a potential candidate to fill this niche. Why I believe it is prematurely? Because it is not yet clear whether Vakarchuk is himself ready to nominate himself for the presidency. And secondly, because Vakarchuk simply doesn't have any political force that stands behind him. Ukraine doesn't have real political parties. It has all sorts of blocs, unions, funded by the oligarchs. These are all virtual parties with very murky political agenda. And to establish closer links between civil society and the people of Ukraine, civil society has to work with volunteers and political parties to mobilize real support for the political agenda. Euromaidan activists who are members of, I don't know, Democratic Alliance, Sila Людей, and other political forces, they still have almost 1.5 years. Yes, they should support and continue the anti-corruption efforts. Yes, they should continue revealing all sorts of misdeeds which are currently done by the authorities. But nevertheless, they should diversify their activities. You know, they should meet with the people to explain their political agenda, to clearly demonstrate what kind of a political, economic, cultural, social, and humanitarian reforms they can offer. Because we, as I wrote in my paper, know very well what they stand against. They stand against corruption, but they do not provide too much detail in between. You know, what will you do if one day you will become in charge of Ukraine? What would be your reform effort in education? How you see Ukraine's culture developing? So my short-term solution is to strengthen political parties in Ukraine, especially those parties which are led by young and promising politicians, because Ukraine will not change until the new generation of its leaders changes. And of course, in connection with this, sorry to kind of bring so much information in one speech, Ukraine now has, and with probably the pressure from the international community, has to do something with the Central Election Commission, because this would be the key institution responsible for delivering and ensuring that the next presidential and parliamentary elections are clean. You know that 13 mandates out of 15 members of the Central Election Commission is already out, kind of terminated. They have to be terminated. And nevertheless, President Poroshenko failed to nominate new candidates to the Central Election Commission because naturally he wants to have a loyal Central Election Commission which would ensure, you know, that everything is under control. So even Mr. Akhendovsky, who is now chairman of the Central Election Commission, is facing criminal charges for accepting bribe from the Party of Regions. You know, he was in charge of the Central Commission under the Yanukovych regime. Isn't it illogical, you know, that we have a guy who is under criminal investigation still in charge of the Central Election Commission? It means that the authorities are simply keeping him on the hook, probably, and kind of manipulating and exerting pressure on him if necessary. So the political process, and just focus on the reform agenda, just focus on the next cycle, real cycle. We don't have to impeach the president now. We don't need premature elections. Let's Ukraine do its homework, and within the time frames that is still available for Ukraine's leaders to develop sound programs and to demonstrate in the next cycle of elections, which I would believe would be fair for everyone, to fight for the voters with their strong programs.
May I ask you just a very short answer? President impeachment, not now. It's clearly from your point of view. What about Prosecutor General and the head of the security service of Ukraine? Based on the actions last night and the previous, again, the political opponents and civil activists and so on. What is your attitude?
As I explained, I believe that President Poroshenko will find a third Mr. Shokin or Mr. Lutsenko, whatever his or her name would be.
All right, thank you very much. It's very important and very informative answer. It will be another Mr. Gritsak, another Mr. Lutsenko.
Just to let you know that yesterday the prosecutors generals, they started the criminal investigation against Bendukidze Center. We saw Vladimir Fedorin, who is the head. So just don't forget about that. To build political parties, you need the freedom, because otherwise you're going to be prosecuted by the corrupt law enforcement authorities, and that's a big problem.
All right, thank you. Professor Osland.
Anders Åslund, Atlantic Council. Thank you very much for excellent presentation, and congratulations to you, Andrei, for putting this together. My question concerns property rights and the judicial system. 3 countries have really succeeded. Georgia, as mentioned, Estonia, and East Germany. They sacked all prosecutors, they sacked all judges, and built up new systems. And shouldn't that be done, as with NABO, new system, and outside international judges who put it up? Isn't this the way to go? And these are the key institutions, as Andrei mentioned, Prosecutor's Office and SPO, and also don't forget the judges. These 3 institutions, sufficiently few people so they can all be moved aside, and there are sufficiently many who can take their jobs and be competent. But you need to have an outside force, as with the appointment of Sitnik for NABO. Isn't this the way to go? Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
And before I give you a chance to answer, I would like to ask you, Anders, for bringing the issue of NABU, National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, which is now the most independent, the most honest organization that is fighting corruption. It is under unprecedented concentrated attack from the authorities. Not only Mr. Saakashvili, not only Binduk in the center, but those who really fighting corruption. Okay, Mr. Nosенко, what would be your answer to the question?
Yeah, I mean, we have witnessed some efforts to do that with the national police, building a new force, but it's some sort of stop it in the middle. But I completely support that we need to completely get rid of old people in the legal system. You couldn't just repair it. It's just, I mean, impossible. You need to start from the scratch. I completely agree.
Okay.
I am not an economist, so I simply pass on this question. Sorry, I'm not an expert.
Not so much about economy, it's about institutional development, institutional structure of the country. Okay, anyway, so the gentleman over there.
Hello, welcome to DC. Andrei, thanks for moderating. So my question, I'm Mikola Vorobyov, research fellow at Johns Hopkins University. I have like 2 short questions. So the first is about, and Andrei, to you too. So I expect that you can answer also. The first is about what do you expect about this current uprising? Because here in DC we hear different message about Saakashvili and about his yesterday detentions, about his connection allegedly with Kurchenko and so forth. So what do you expect? It's going to be another revolution? It's going to be just another pressure or early elections? And how you expect the United States to maybe intervene in this case? So what do you expect from the United States at this moment on its policy towards Ukraine? Thank you very much.
All right.
Well, I think the United States just recently, yesterday, has issued a statement and urged all participants of this process, both the protesters and the government, to ensure that all of this is resolved in a peaceful manner. And I don't think that the United States government will make any other public statements to go any further, because this would be considered an interference into Ukraine's domestic political process. And as long as politically charged, politically motivated persecution of Saakashvili's supporters stop, as soon as Ukraine's migration service stopped arresting and kind of deporting his supporters from the country, I believe that the pressure, international pressure on the Ukrainian government will be diminished in this case. But the protests will probably continue until the Rada convenes again and votes on other demands which had been publicly put on the floor by the protesters. So far, I believe that only one demand had been discussed in the Rada, and this is the new law on the election to get rid of the single mandate constituencies and to ensure that Ukraine will hold its next election under the pure proportional system with open party lists.
All right.
Yeah, I just wanted to add that I mean, this is obvious that those days, like when the media space is just monopolized in Ukraine and law enforcement is not in a good shape. I mean, we could not just say is it true or not true. We just can say the system is sick and have to be completely destroyed again. I mean, it just, to give you an example, like when your house is just 100 years old and never been really repaired, you have a hole in the roof, and instead of changing the roof, you just paint the wall. I mean, that was exactly going on in Ukraine for 26 years. I mean, and the example of the Baltic countries seems to be good because I remember I was crossing the border of Lithuania from Belarus in 1993. There was a visa, there was a strong police control on the border. I mean, they managed to separate from the old system very quickly. And that was the key success. I mean, I'm not saying we need to separate from the world, but we need to be proud of being Ukrainians. I mean, doesn't matter what happened. I mean, that's the interest of Ukraine have to be the first. And then the rest is just, we choose what is the best for us. European Union, the union with Singapore, or the union with Antarctica. I mean, that's the secondary question. I mean, the elite have to be responsible for what's going on. And then the shame, I call it the shame, what is going on now in Kiev, is the shame because the elite have to find a compromise. I mean, they have to find a compromise and sacrifice their personal interest. And that's the key. I mean, the rest is just secondary. Thank you.
Okay, very short comments on your question about this accusation of Mr. Saakashvili and conspiring with Russian FSB and services. So they are ridiculous. Mr. Saakashvili is the most hated person by Mr. Putin in the whole post-Soviet space and maybe in the whole world. Mr. Saakashvili was able to defend Georgia in year 2008 war during aggression. He did not allow Russian troops to conquer Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. He did not allow Putin to overthrow the Georgian government. He was able to defend Georgian independence. And Georgia still is an independent country, not a puppet regime as Mr. Putin wanted. Mr. Saakashvili moved to Odessa and actually did not allow to develop what we can see now in east of Ukraine in Donbass, because it exactly what the plan was to do it in Transnistria in Odessa region. He was effectively in putting down this coup plot organized by the FSB. He was extremely helpful in bringing Ukraine towards Europe, not only building highways, but kind of bringing and building the Navy base for Ukrainian Navy in Odessa, strengthening it. Just his plan for the 70 days how to transform Ukraine, it's a la Georgia plan for fast reformation of Ukraine to produce the similar results that he has been able to achieve in Georgia. So all these accusations are completely ridiculous, and it shows the level and style of the attitudes that demonstrated by the current Ukrainian governments towards Mr. Saakashvili, towards Mr. Fedorin in Bendukidze Center, towards Nabu, towards many others, their political opponents. I have just really last minute, and I would really ask both of you to give us your short advice to the West. What do you think West should do now in this very difficult situation for Ukraine, with aggression from outside, with the continuing corruption, with this rising authoritarian regime in Ukraine? What would be the right policy of the West, of the friends of Ukraine around the world towards Ukraine?
Let me, I mean, shortly speaking, my appeal is that just separate the government of Ukraine and Ukrainian people. I mean, if you think helping Ukrainian people, that's good, but don't help that government, because that government is not for Ukraine.
Well, this is a very broad question. My immediate reaction would be, as I said in my 10-minute introduction, to start speaking the truth and have a mature dialogue with the Ukrainian authorities and kind of have a checkpoint, what went well, what went wrong, and to link all financial and economic assistance which Ukraine currently receives from the European Union and from the United States only to Ukraine's success with regard to the anti-corruption reform. Probably some of you in this audience have heard about the so-called Marshall Plan, or now it's called the European Plan for Ukraine, which is strongly lobbied by Ukraine's Lithuanian friends. It is an idea of the former Prime Minister Kubilius, and now it's discussed now in the European Union. I personally believe that with all the very positive intentions that Europeans now have put inside of this idea of the Marshall Plan of Ukraine, providing a lot of economic assistance to the current government, I believe that before the next presidential elections, it would be a wrong idea because it would create an uneven political playing level field and can be used by the current authorities to demonstrate once again that they have achieved tremendous progress with Ukraine's economic, political, and anti-corruption reforms. And secondly, by putting the financial, what I call cart, in front of the horse, you make the horse lazy and you don't let the horse really drive the cart, and that's what the Ukrainian government is supposed to do. Ukrainian government has to lead, not to be led. And that is what we currently lack. So the West, as I said, have to be open and sincere, but also make sure that all further financial assistance that Ukraine receives has linked to very tangible and concrete specific results on Ukraine's economic and anti-corruption fronts.
All right, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm really sorry, but we need to finish because our time is up. So could you please help me to thank our excellent speakers today for this wonderful presentation?